deliver this. Got it. I can also deliver this PowerPoint presentation for everybody. So
I will make this the PowerPoint available after the meeting's over with for everyone.
Perfect. Good. So if you missed something, that's okay. You get to take this home. So I've made a few key corrections just to do a clean edit, to bring up the colors I wanted to bring up, and to straighten the image and crop it. I wanted to, again, it's hard to get your subject right in the middle when you're flailing around with the camera. So I've done an 8:10 crop to make sure my subject is there in the center. So what I've done next is I've added an overlay. So the picture on the right is these sort of purple swoops. I took that the same day at the Museum of Science. And this was it was part of an exhibit about prisms. And I thought the light was pretty, so I took a few ICM images, and I always store those in a separate folder on my desktop to use as overlays later. And I thought I would like to enhance the colors and see what I got. This is the final image. And see what I wrote. I wrote, ICM images lend themselves well to layering in Photoshop. And I'm sure this is familiar to some of you, and to some of you it's not. So I won't go deep into detail here, but it's something I can answer questions about. But there are different blending modes if you would like to combine two images in Photoshop. And it changes the way the light comes through the second image through to the first image. So this was blending mode multiply, but screen will also yield a really lovely soft effect. Soft light is nice as well. And ultimately the idea of an overlay is to add extra color and dimension to your work. And I decided to change the color story here. The overlay was so purple, I've made this a purple and yellow image for my final. So why use intentional camera movement? You can use it to enhance your visual storytelling. This is the principal reason that I use it, to promote a sense of movement, of growth, or of transience. In the image on the right, we'd been traveling all day. We went through this mountain pass, and I was in the passenger seat of the car, and that wedge shape of the mountains with the lights on the highway leading through it was so compelling. This was shot with a 50mm lens with an exposure of about 1/8 of a second. I wanted to capture that feeling of movement. And in the picture on the left, this was also taken at the Light Tower. This is at the Eskenazi Museum of Art here in Bloomington. And I've been taking pictures with my children, and I saw my shadow so large next to my son. And I wanted to capture that feeling, that dreamlike feeling of transience in early childhood, where he's already bigger than this. This was last year. So I switched to a longer exposure to capture this shot. You can use ICM to tell a color story. Look for color harmonies or contrasting colors in your environment. This was a ginkgo tree and a red maple side by side at Bloomington High School South at sunset. So this was just the color story. I saw the red and the orange and the yellow. It's also a transitory time of year, and I used ICM to tell that story.
That's 3 separate images, right?
There are 3 separate images. Okay. Yeah. And all with different motions, you know, from curling to swirling and diagonal motion as well. For exaggeration, I like to use ICM to exaggerate details in a scene, details like lines or crowding or repetition. And ICM does a wonderful job of exaggerating those details.
How did you do that specifically, and what is in there?
I'm glad you asked, Juliet, because this one is slightly outside of the scope of the presentation. This is a double exposure. The first exposure is a straight shot of the bicycles. The second shot is an ICM. It's a vertical movement of the camera.
Okay, thank you.
And similar techniques. So we're just going to brush on this one, but I know that some people practice using this method as well. This is not technically ICM, but it's also moving the camera while shooting. This is a multiple exposure. Multiple exposures also employ camera movement while shooting, but instead of taking a single long exposure, the photographer will take several imprints of the scene while moving the camera. So you can move the camera in tiny motions, like on the left, to exaggerate the repetition of all those tiny windows. Or in this case, on the image on the right, I've moved the camera quite a bit to multiply the buildings and increase that sense of depth. There's this feeling that the buildings march off into the distance, and there's a feel of layering and of fogginess.
Hey, Lisa, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Sarah. Do you prefer to use to do the layering in Photoshop in post, or do you use an in-camera like multiple exposure? I know that for some cameras that's an option.
Yes. So I was going to say several answers. So first, I'll start by saying that if you have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you can take a multiple exposure in camera. I forgot to mention. If you have a point and shoot camera, you will have to do this in Photoshop. I prefer to do my multiple exposures, that is 3 or more, to sort of stamp the images. I prefer to do that in camera. I like the feeling of standing at the scene, moving the camera slightly. My camera will actually demonstrate to me how the pictures are imprinting on top of one another, so I get a good visual at the scene. If I'm taking a double exposure, I do a lot of self-portrait work with double exposures, and those have deeper meaning to me. I will do those in post in Photoshop because I have more control over the final image. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. I did not include this artist in, I have some example artists at the end, but there is an artist named Pep Venturo who does multiple exposures in Photoshop. He does up to 60 images at a time, and he will often walk around a single subject. So he will walk all the way around a cherry tree, for instance, and imprint those. And those are very painterly and beautiful and done in Photoshop. So it's entirely possible. Some examples. These are all multiple exposures and taken for the same reasons that you might take an ICM photograph. So mostly to exaggerate the details of a scene or to show something through time. The image on the top left, the birds were swirling around, so you can see them, the same birds in the background of the shot as well as the foreground. And I like being able to capture details through time in a single frame. So to review, choose your subjects. So I think for a lot of beginning ICM photographers, there's a misconception that, just moving the camera is the art. But there's an additional art to it. It's good to know what your subject is, to shoot with composition in mind. As with any other good photograph, you want to have balance, compositional balance in your photograph. You would like to have color harmony in your photograph. You'll start with a slow shutter speed, anywhere from 2 to 1/25th of a second. I usually start around 1/8 of a second, but that's how long I like my lines to be. This image here was shot 1/15th of a second. It was shot indoors. So I actually had my ISO at 200 to bring in enough light to make this shot. And have fun, be creative with shooting. Don't forget to edit, that's a key component. And if you feel like it, try overlaying textures or other ICM images to create a rich final product with lots of depth and color. Finally, I wanted to share 2 other ICM artists who really inspire me. This is Reem Al Sheikh. She lives in Oman, and she started shooting ICM when her children were in high school. She would take a walk on the beach every day, the same beach, and she got tired of photographing it in the same way. So she challenged herself to visualize the ocean in other ways. And she still is a landscape and a texture focused photographer, but she's also moved on to photographing women in Oman and photographing the private lives of women and the public lives of women. So the picture on the top right is women in the marketplace in her hometown of Muscat. And the second photographer to share is Andy Gray. If you follow ICM photography at all, you might already know Andy Gray. He has a YouTube channel where he shares all parts of his process from the shooting to the editing. And he edits a lot. So it's really fun and encouraging as a beginning ICM photographer to see him take an image out of camera that doesn't look like much and turn it into a work of art. So something he's really famous for doing is he will take multiple photographs of a scene and stack them on top of each other. So it is the same castle or the same lighthouse, but he's shooting it from different angles and stacking them on top of each other to create his final image. And these are flyers from his self-published e-zine called Intentional. So that's it for the part that I have planned already. Thank you guys so much. I hope my pacing was all right. I know I went fast.
Lisa, I have a question.
Questions. Yeah.
This is Tom. Have you ever experimented with movement of the lens, like a zoom lens, a short exposure while you're zooming?
Yeah, and that yields a very interesting, I think of it as a Star Wars zoom effect. You know, from the opening credits where you're zooming through the stars. Yeah, it makes diagonal light trails that go into the center or outwards from the center of the photo. I usually shoot prime lenses. So you'll see most of my work is it's either a 35 or a 50 millimeter prime. And no zooming potential.
Lisa, this is Jack.
Hi, Jack.
Can you talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your photographic background? How did you hit upon this technique and create such wonderful stuff with it?
Oh, thank you. I am self-taught. I started taking photographs in college. I'm 35 years old. So I shot digital from the time that I was 18 until now. I've only just started learning film, and Jaime is holding my hand. So I'm not a traditional film photographer. I've grown up with digital. And my husband and I did Peace Corps together. And I started taking a lot of photographs then. I think that's when I really expanded, because I wanted to save everything about my site and the people we lived with and my house and our country. We lived in Mozambique.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you. And coming back from the Peace Corps, I was pregnant with my daughter. And I took pictures of her and then took pictures of her little friends. And it grew into a big business, and it grew into a really big business. We were living in California at the time, and I became a full-time wedding and family photographer for 6 years while we lived there. And now we live here. We moved here during the pandemic. My daughter is now 8. And I have 2 others as well. They're age 3 and 6. And because they were home a lot, especially in the early days of COVID, I took a step back from business and I started focusing on fine art and more experimental techniques. So this is how I wound up here doing the fun stuff.
Well, it certainly looks like it's a lot of fun just from the expression on your face when you talk about your kids.
Yeah, thank you. My husband is giving them a bath right now.
Can you, there's one of your pictures I'd like to, can you leaf back through your slides a little bit?
Yes, I can.
Keep going. Keep going. Whoa, stop.
Here.
That lower left-hand picture is intriguing to me. Well,
Yeah.
tell me something about that. It's really cool looking.
Thank you. This is the one that is different in terms of water-inspired images. The other 5 images are all looking down into water, whether it's a river or the bottom right is a fountain at IU. That's the mermaid fountain. The bottom left is boats on a river with the sunset above it and a heavy layer of clouds on top. So the light was already sandwiched in real life. And this is a key part of ICM is the scene already has to look good in real life. ICM is not really going to elevate a blah scene. It's just going to abstractify the scene that you're looking at. So we have a dark layer of water at the bottom, boats floating with lights above the layer of water or on top of the water, a thin slice of sunset, end of sunset light, sandwiched under a dark, heavy cloud layer. So the photograph was already there. It was set up before I moved the camera.
Yeah, that's just, they're all really nice, but that one just draws me right in. It's like, I just want to stare at it. I don't know why.
Oh, well, thank you, Jack. I want to tell you that this one was taken from the top of my grandmother's building. She lived for 35 years in Washington, D.C. She passed away a year and a half ago in May, and this one was taken at her celebration of life. And when I looked down at the water and I saw the beautiful sunset and the beautiful boats, it just felt like such a lovely visual homage to a person that was really important to many of us. So thank you.
That's a great story.
Yeah, thank you.
Lisa, could you go, this is Dorothy Ann, skip ahead to a series of photos you took, and one of them was of buildings and looked like it was taken at a sunset or sunrise. I wanted to, oh, there it is.
Sure. Okay. I lost you, Dorothy Ann, but I can just talk about it.
Okay.
Okay. So the upper right or the lower left?
The upper right.
Okay. Because both of those were taken in Chicago, months apart and at different times of day. But the concept is the same. I wanted to exaggerate the dizzying effect of all of the windows and really like the glory of what humans have created. It's very easy to be impressed by things when you're in Chicago. This is sunset. This is just the last minutes of sunset. In fact, the sun has already set, which is helpful because in ICM or in a multiple exposure, if you have a big yellow ball, that's the sun, and then you are printing that 9 times, it's a little overwhelming. So it's nice to have a smoother gradient of light that you're capturing. Just past sunset, this beautiful gradient was already there. The lights were already there, and all I had to do was stand there. I took my picture. I underexposed slightly because I knew that the lightest parts of the photo would print on top of the other light parts of the photo, and I didn't want to blow out my highlights. And I just moved the camera slightly left and right and up to create that layering effect, building on top of one another.
Approximately how many exposures do you use on those 2 pictures, Lisa? Do you remember?
Those are both 8 or 9. The maximum that the Canon R6 will take is 9 in one shot.
That one on the bottom right is, where is that? The foggy tree thing?
So that's standing on my front porch looking at the trees across the cul-de-sac. And I had to angle it up so I didn't get the tops of the houses in my very suburban residential neighborhood.
It could have been a rainforest jungle from South America.
It looks, I mean, that it feels so foggy. Like I've said, that the subject matter is important. The light was already beautiful. That heavy cloud layer that balanced out the heavy darkness of the trees, that was already present before I started taking pictures. Editing did a nice trick there too. I definitely, I cooled this down. So I took the where's my word? The warmth slider down towards blue. And I've also, in the calibration panel, I like to play with the highlight tone. I moved the shadow tone. I've moved the shadows towards green. Does that make sense? Yes. I like that overall cool effect.
More questions? We have more time.
I am going to stop the recording.
Not a question, but it's very well done. Thank you.